Hello again everybody, and I'm going to continue talking today more about travel and transport, and this time rather than roads I'm going by boat. And two pieces of literature, two pieces of primary source material to think about. One is from a familiar source and one is probably from a very unfamiliar source to you. So I'll introduce those when we get there. Yesterday I talked about roads and how hazardous and potentially uncomfortable they were, travelling by cart or carriage or walking, or if you were really lucky you might be in the cavalry or the imperial post. Today, shipping. Two aspects really, travel by grain ship and then one person who is being told, story related, who was essentially a prisoner who was also travelling on a grain ship. Trade was absolutely vital to Rome. It was encouraged by roads, and economic development was very much fostered by the building of roads, but most of the big stuff, like now, went by ship. So it was too slow and too difficult, and you couldn't take enough stuff to take it all by road. So if you were going any distance with any amount of stuff, you'd put it on, take it down to the harbour, and you'd put it on a big ship and it would be transported. It's like international cargo stuff now, really. The biggest item that was transported around was pretty much always grain. The Romans were always short of grain, so when they conquered Sicily, it was a big store of grain. It was the grain basket of Italy. Then when Egypt came within the empire in the late 1st century BC, massive port at Alexandria with the famous lighthouse, then a lot of grain was exported to Italy. Grain was even exported from southeast Britain to Italy, even though that would have taken a pretty long time to get from the south coast to Italy. A lot of the grain went to two ports in particular. One was Puteoli in the Bay of Naples, had a very good harbour, and the other was Ostia, the harbour city of Rome. In the case of Puteoli, stuff was taken off the ships and then put on onto road transport and transported up the roads, particularly it's the Appian Way basically, up to Rome. And if it was to Ostia, it went by river barge. And Ostia gradually silted up, and a new harbour was built under Hadrian, which had the imaginative name of Portus, harbour. Anyway. The first piece of literature is from a writer called Lucian. Now Lucian is hardly ever read these days, but he's a curious writer really. He was writing in the mid-2nd century AD. He wrote satires and things that nowadays we'd describe as sort of novels, like proto-novels, including, he's the first person I think that we know of who ever wrote about a fantasy trip to the moon. He also, in his piece called True Histories. He also wrote a piece called The Ship, which is sort of like a novel which is about ships plying the trade route between Alexandria and Italy. And they went around the coastline via Turkey, Malta, Crete and thence to Italy. They sailed around the coastline rather than going across open sea. The idea was that you sailed by day and anchored by night. It's very difficult and hazardous to navigate at night in ancient times. So the characters in this extract are talking about seeing a grain ship and describing potentially some of the hazards en route. So this is Lucian from The Ship. And the first character is called Timoleus. I remember now, Simippus, where it was we lost Adimantus. It was when we were standing all that time, looking up at the mast, counting the layers of hides, watching in amazement as the sailor going up the reefs, then running up there in the yardarm, perfectly safe, supporting himself by the yardarm tackling. Simippus, his friend, says, "Incidentally, what a big ship, about 180 feet long. A shipbuilder would say, and something over a quarter of that in beam. And the maximum depth from deck to keel through the hold about 44 feet. And then the height of the mast, what a huge yardarm it has, and what a forestay it requires to secure it. And how the stern rises with its gentle curve, with its gilded beak balanced at the opposite end by the long rising extension of the prow, with the figure of the name goddess of the ship, Isis, on either side. Now, as to the other ornamental details, the paintings and the fiery bright topsail, I was more astonished by the anchors and the capstans and the windlasses and the stern cabins. The size of the crew could be compared to that of an army. And they were saying she carried enough grain to feed everybody in Attica, the area around Athens, for a whole year. Timoleus says, they set sail with a moderate wind from Pharos, the lighthouse of Alexandria, and sighted Achamus on the 7th day. Then a west wind blew up, and they were carried off their course as far as Sidon, in what nowadays we call Lebanon. On their way thence they fell in with a heavy gale, and on the 10th day came through the straits to the Calydon Isles, and there they all nearly went to the bottom on a pitch dark night. However, the gods were responsive to their lamentation, showed them a fire from Lycia which enabled them to identify that place, and a bright star, either Castor or Pollux, appeared at the masthead, guided the ship into the open sea on their left just as she was making straight for the cliff. Thence, having once fallen off their proper course, they sailed through the Aegean, beating up against adverse winds until they came to anchor in Piraeus, yesterday the 70th day out from Egypt. So far off their course were they carried. If they'd taken the proper route by Crete on their right, they'd have sailed beyond Malea and been in Italy by this time. So difficulties with sailing, but an enormous ship with a huge crew and lots of men working on there. Enough grain to feed the people of Attica for a whole year. Must have been quite a sight. The second reading comes from the Acts of the Apostles, a historical work written by St. Luke, and a lot of it is about St. Paul. And St. Paul had got arrested, and he had appealed to be tried by the emperor in Rome. Now, he didn't do that lightly, but anyway, he was being transported to Rome to stand trial. And he was on board this ship. It was another grain ship, and things went quite badly wrong because there was a storm. And this is what it says. It was the 14th night of the storm, and we were drifting through the Adriatic, when about midnight the sailors began to suspect there was land ahead. On taking soundings, they found a depth of 20 fathoms, and a little later, taking soundings again, they found a depth of 15. Then, as they were afraid we might go onto the rocks, they dropped 4 anchors from the stern, waited anxiously for daylight. The sailors wanted to escape from the ship and actually lowered the boats into the sea, pretending they were going to run out anchors from the bow. But Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, "You can't be saved unless these men stay on board." Then the soldiers cut the ropes that held the boat and let it drift away. Until daybreak, Paul kept urging them all to take something to eat. We were about 76 souls on board. When they'd had enough to eat, they threw the wheat into the sea in order to lighten the ship. And there is another source, by the way, who says that there might have been over 200 people on the ship. When daylight came, they couldn't recognise the coast, but they saw a bay with a beach and determined to run the ship ashore there if possible. So they cast off the anchors and left them in the sea. At the same time, they undid the lashing of the rudders, and hoisting the foresail to the wind, they made for the beach. But they struck a shoal and ran the ship aground. The bow stuck and couldn't be moved, while the stern began to break up under the strain. The soldiers proposed to kill the prisoners, for fear some of them might swim ashore and escape, but the centurion wanted to save Paul, so he prevented them from doing this and ordered all who could swim to jump overboard first and get to land, and the rest to follow on planks or other pieces of the wreckage of the boat. So they all got safely to land. After our escape, we learned the island was called Malta. The natives showed us remarkable kindness, for they made a fire and welcomed us all because of the rain that had come on and the cold. 3 months later, we sailed on an Alexandrian ship with Castor and Pollux as its figurehead, which had wintered at the island. We put in at Syracuse, on Sicily, and stayed there 3 days. Then we weighed anchor and reached Rhegium. A day later, a south wind sprang up, and the following day we arrived at Puteoli, the second of those big harbours on the west coast of Italy. So Paul would have travelled up the Appian Way and arrived in Rome, lived under house arrest for a while, and then probably bit the dust after Nero's persecution after the Great Fire. Reflecting on all this has made me think more than anything else about who the people were who were actually involved in all this, the sailors. And as we now look to maybe travel a bit more in these times of corona crisis, The people who've been keeping things going, a lot of them, the key workers, are people like truck drivers and sailors who transport food around, even in the toughest of times. So just as the Romans needed these sailors, these poor frightened sailors, sometimes very tough men indeed, so we should be grateful to the key workers now of people like truckers and sailors and airline pilots, and be glad of their skills and their toughness now.